Hello everyone, welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Andrew Fanning, who is the Research and Data Analysis Lead at the Doughnut Economics Action Lab and is a visiting research fellow at the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds, to discuss his work in quantification, data analysis, downscaling the donut, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. It's truly an honor.
No, thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
To start, I guess, could you go into, what it is that you do?
Sure. I'm as you mentioned, thanks for the intro, the Research and Data Analysis Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. So what is Doughnut Economics Action Lab? That's an organization co-founded by my colleagues, Kate Rayworth and Carlota Sanz back in 2019. And really, it exists to take the ideas that Kate pulled together in her best-selling book that was published in 2017, start making visible the energy that people were kind of putting into picking up the ideas and putting them into practice, whether in a classroom or in a business, boardroom or in City Hall or community practitioners, and so on and so on and so on. So Kate spent about 2 years going around, mostly in Europe, but also I think she did a couple tours in the United States as well, sharing these ideas. And she's a brilliant communicator. So I'm her colleague and also kind of a fanboy. But she spent quite a bit of time communicating these ideas. And what she was finding is that after her talks and after things, people would come up to her and say, yeah, I'm putting this in. I mean, I already put it into my lesson. Or do you have any materials that I could use to kind of put this into practice where I am? And so on and so on. And so Kate really got together with Carlota and formed Doughnut Economics Action Lab with that in mind. And I mean, the name is quite intentional. It's Doughnut Economics, which we can get into in a moment. But the lab part is recognizing that a lot of this stuff that we talk about is about transforming an economic system that has never been designed to meet the challenges that we're facing today, both ecologically and socially. And so we need to experiment and we need to try things. And so that's one part. And the other part is the action, in that we're not aiming to just generate research for its own sake. There's knowledge, but there's also a lot of urgency that we're facing today. And so what we want to do is create tools and share stories that others can pick up and be inspired by in order to, hopefully generate a kind of peer-to-peer inspiration that is strong enough to turn the current course, which is quite alarming, both ecologically and socially, that we can actually move that Titanic of a boat in the direction that we want. So a lot of what I've been doing is leading the research and data analysis part of our work, which kind of has three hats. One of which is leading kind of research, like high impact research that we think is important to publish in the record and also make available and widely accessible to as many people as possible. So I'm really quite passionate about how can we make visible in data the type of transformations and the type of metrics that are needed to meet the goal of meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So that's kind of the goal of Doughnut Economics, is that. So how can we make that visible through data? So that's one part. Another part is also trying to build a network of like-minded researchers or researchers who are engaging with the concepts of Doughnut Economics and trying to connect with them and make visible and create tools, as I mentioned, that they can pick up. And whether it's for researchers, a lot of the times it's just making resources like lists of articles, or one big thing is lists of dissertations, because a lot of the work that we're seeing is practice-led. And a lot of that means that it tends to move quickly. And sometimes academic research moves quite slowly. And so I've really been observing that bachelor's and master's dissertations are just a treasure trove of insights in our work. But they're often very dispersed, right? There's so many different departments and they publish different, it can be hard to find them. So one thing that actually gives me a lot of energy is asking people to share their dissertations with me so that we can publish them as a tool on our platform where others prospective students can read them and see them and be inspired by them. So that's another part of our work. And the third part is more about, it's almost like a technical support role where we're getting a lot of cities or businesses or community practitioners who are picking up our tools and trying to use them from a data perspective, but might not have had the privilege that I consider that I have had in spending 10 years of looking at how can we apply these methods in reading. And so it's a role of trying to provide technical support when needed and when called upon. So that's kind of what I do.
Yeah, no, that's all of that is super cool. I mean, I think it's really important that any research has a way of implementation and being actually utilized by everyone. Yeah, no, that point about just dissertations, like, where did they end up after they've been written? And like, if not read, if not used, then what's the point almost? But yeah, no, that's super cool. Really excited about the work that you guys are doing at DEAL. Is that an acronym that you guys say? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I was on the fence about that acronym at first, to be honest. Of course, the longer that you spend using something and embedded in something, the more used to it you get. So we can also, Doughnut Economics Action Lab is a bit of a mouthful. So if you'd like, we can just revert to DEAL.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, and you'd kind of gone into this, but I mean, I think it would be useful to define what exactly is Doughnut Economics. I went down a rabbit hole of reading, but I guess, like, what about this model is unique, and what are some, I don't know, like, flaws or just differences in economics that are more, general today that this model addresses?
Great question. So, yeah, the donut, I guess there's three parts to that. So the donut itself is almost more like an indicator-based framework, and it's a framework that Kate drew back and published in a report back in 2012. And it essentially, you just imagine two concentric rings, one inside the other, and the space between those rings has the shape of the donut. So that's actually where the donut comes from. But the outer ring is visualized as an ecological ceiling, and the inner ring is visualized as what you could call a social foundation. And the whole idea of framework is that we can think of it as a compass where we want to be in the space between those two rings, where we are meeting the needs of all people, so everyone has enough to meet their essential needs for food, water, and health, and education, political voice, and gender equality, racial equality, and all of the minimum social foundations that are required to live a dignified life. We get everybody up above that, but simultaneously not so high that our level of resource use is exceeding that ecological ceiling, where we're causing climate breakdown, where we're witnessing the unraveling of the web of life and biodiversity loss and nutrient overloading and ocean acidification and land conversion and all of those ecological challenges that we face, that we want to find that sweet spot, which is visualized by a donut, where we can actually achieve those two goals. And that's what the donut signifies. We think of it as a compass. So it shows the goal, get in the donut. We can also attach numbers to it, and which is what Kate did, and showed, currently the world is living perilously out of balance, right? There are billions of people who are falling short on meeting their essential needs, while simultaneously we're now overshooting 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries which define the ecological ceiling. So that's a big challenge. And what we need to do is, and a lot of our work is then spent on, okay, this is the picture that we have. Here's our goal. Here's how we're doing, not well. Then how can we redesign the economic systems that we have inherited so that they are fit for this challenge? And that is not the economic system that we received, right? Like, we need to design new policies, new theories, new models, new metrics that are, that can face this challenge of getting into the donut from both sides at the same time. You know what I mean? So Doughnut Economics is really about that way of thinking. So Kate followed up the 2012 report with her 2017 book, which called Doughnut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And in it, one of, the first way to think is changing the goal. So we want to move away from, as an economic system, the pursuit of economic growth, GDP growth, just endlessly forever, and replace that with a proactive goal of living in the donut, of meeting the needs of all within the means of the living planet. And then she identified 6 other ways of thinking that can help us transition away from the 20th century economic mindset we've inherited, whether it's about, a very mechanistic and reductionist understanding of our systems, or a very divisive, unequal distribution of resources, or so on and so on and so on, and transform those into, in this case, a more complex systems understanding where we recognize feedback loops and other parts of, interrelationships and power relations and so on. Or if it comes to divisive systems, like how can we build far more distributive networks so that we can just have a much more just and more egalitarian type society while making sure that everyone has enough resources to achieve what they need. So that's Doughnut Economics. And then the major flaws that it aims to address, each of those 7 ways is kind of contrasted with a 20th century way of economic thinking that we've inherited. I would highlight, I guess, a couple of them. One of them is the first picture that you see in economics. Have you taken any economics courses at
some of them? Trying to get into it, but yeah, it's with the
very, very common. Still too common, in my opinion, today, is the very first class that you would take in economics, the first year
supply and
in
demand or whatnot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That first image, I think, it just has such a profound influence on the rest of what we think of as economics, because, that first thing is like, what is economics? Well, it's this, right? It's price, it's quantity, it's supply meets demand in markets. And of course, anything that is not traded through markets is implicitly,
external,
has no value. It's just completely invisible. Yeah. So so much of our what it means to live life on this planet doesn't take place in the market, and I don't think it should. And I think that it's a profound error to label that aspect of life, the fundamental dependence on the living world, as well as our time with our families and so on, as an externality. It's just completely getting things back to front, in my view. And so I would replace that much more with a view of an economy which is embedded in society, which is embedded in turn with the Earth system, and recognize that, of course, the economy is also a social construct that we meet and we provide for our goods and services in different ways. Like one of those ways, and an important way, is through markets, right? But that's not the only way. We don't show up just as buyers and sellers, or, lenders and borrowers. We also show up in relation to the state, right? There are collective provisionings that we have decided, whether it's health or well, I guess you're dialing in from the United States, but in most other high income nations, health is provided as a collective good, or education, and so on and so on. But we also meet up not just as citizens or as voters or as protesters in relation to the state. We also show up in our households, right? Like we show up every day. We wake up in the morning. I have a family. I have a partner and 2 daughters. A lot of my time and energy is spent raising the kids, spending time just managing the household, taking them to birthday parties, taking them to their things. And all of that is done as part of your, the core essential caring economy that, I'm never expecting my kids I'm never going to get them a bill to say, yeah, remember those 10 years that I spent? No, that's not. Right. It's done. It's outside the market, and it would be profoundly wrong if my kids ever came up to me and said, hey, those 15 years that you cared for me, here's 10 grand. Thank you very much. I feel like, get out of here. What? It would be offensive, right? but we also show up in relation to outside of our households, but without needing a market or a state. There's the commons, right? There's all kinds of examples. Elinor Ostrom is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who lent so much of this work, recognizing that as long as there's certain sets of rules, a community is more than capable of self-organizing and enforcing those rules without necessarily a higher top-down influence from a state or a market-based solution where it's enforcing property rights and all of that stuff that markets need. So anyway, that is some of the issues with economics, and I focus there on the need to replace that supply and demand image as the first one.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like you mentioned, yeah, no, that certainly is what appeals to me about the Doughnut Economics, which when I first read about it, is it really captures those externalities that, it's just completely forgone, and especially like with stuff like pollution and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, going into that, like you had mentioned stuff about, GDP and whatnot. I like when I first read about economics, like I conflated the Doughnut Economics with like circular economy and degrowth and whatnot. What is, I guess maybe the difference between those two terms that I just mentioned, and, how have these models maybe looked like in real life? I know Doughnut Economics certainly has been applied in Amsterdam, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so we are currently, where I mentioned before, a lot of our effort is dedicated to putting these ideas into practice, which is something of a distinction compared to lots of other models. So Kate has a turn of phrase, which I really agree with, which is that 21st century economics will be practiced first and theorized later. And so I would say that that's one distinction between Doughnut Economics, which what we're aiming to do generally is provide tools that others can pick up and apply in their own context. So we're not aiming to have this one size fits all, like tick box, here, do this, and now you're in a Doughnut economy. It's much more about, as I mentioned, it's like ways to think. How can we apply these different ways of thinking that Kate didn't really, she essentially gathered from different strands of heterodox economics, you could call it, whether it's behavioral economics or institutional economics or complexity economics, feminist economics, Marxist economics. There's all these strands that are not typically taught. And I was trained in a very conventional department of economics myself. And you tend to receive this one school of thought, which is known as neoliberal economics. Yeah. And that's where that supply and demand picture is. It tends to be quite quantitative, and it's quite rigid in its assumptions that are quite, very far divorced from the socially adaptable humans that we can show ourselves, that we can show up as. And so I would say that just recognizing that there are these, centuries of thought and bringing them together has been a huge service of Doughnut Economics that I think there's huge benefit in almost remembering what others have said. Yeah. Because so often for me, it's often like the hardest thing is, what's missing. Like if you don't, especially if you're a student, right? Like if your professor doesn't tell you what you need to know, then you have exams and you have multiple courses and you have other things, like it's very hard to
focused on one thing.
Notice what's missing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I discovered the field of ecological economics almost by accident during my master's, and it just blew my mind. But the reason why I discovered it was actually because I wanted to take a course in environmental economics, which is kind of like the conventional version, the neoliberal version of dealing with the environment, which is where this whole language of externalities and market failures and all of that comes from. So I wanted to take a course in that in my department, but they weren't even offering any courses at the graduate level that semester. So I started looking around, and I found a course in the School of Management that said, economics for resource and environmental management. And I was like, well, that sounds like, environmental economics. And I wrote to the professor and said, hey, can I join this? And he was like, yeah, well, I mean, an economist has never joined this. It's mainly for natural scientists who are, I don't know if it's going to be behind the curve or not or whatever. And it turned out to be a course in ecological economics, which is a completely different worldview. It's that one I mentioned before of the nested, like, economy and society in the Earth system. And the biggest criticism that comes across is very much this question of like, how big is the economy and how big should it be? And that question, after I was 6 years deep, so a full bachelor's in economics. I also took international development studies, which is also a different, pulling me in a different direction, but 6 years into formal economics training, and it had never once occurred to me to ask, like, I just always thought, like growth, more income is better. Like, and of course it's not the be all end all, but it's very correlated with health and education and It's the best metric we have. So we would do well to maximize that. And that's basically the goal of our macro, of all countries' economies today. That if they don't grow, we're now in a situation where it's like a straitjacket, right? Like that's called a recession, and things get very, very, very bad. But at the same time, you can't grow forever on a finite planet. It's just not possible. You can't keep growing and growing and growing and growing. So there's a fundamental conflict there that deserves attention because, on the one hand, we can't grow forever. We're going to provoke climate and ecological crises. And as well, the current system we have is not even meeting the needs of all people. So clearly that's not great. But at the same time, if we don't grow in the US, in the world's richest economies that humanity has ever seen, if they don't continue to grow, then, it's suffering and hardship, and the most vulnerable will get hit hardest and first. And so that conflict needs to be fundamentally resolved. And to me, I would much rather dedicate my energy to breaking the growth dependence of the economy than trying to break the laws of physics, because
I think that's definitely
so that's I didn't really answer your question of the differences between circular economy and doughnut economics and so on, but
I think you broke it down really well.
That's one I would just say one thing about degrowth though, because I doughnut economics and degrowth to me are very, very aligned. They share the same worldview. And really, it becomes a question about what is the trajectory and the relationship between if we need to massively reduce resource use in high-income nations. Like, in a lot of my research has pointed to this. In the United States, I was born in Canada, but it's a very similar picture. On a per capita basis, we're using far beyond our fair shares of what this planet can sustain. And so that becomes like, okay, well, if we want to avoid climate and ecological breakdown, which we do, then what is the trajectory of economic growth or of economic activity that would be consistent with that? And so that's where degrowth says, okay, well, in high-income countries, we would say that we should plan, given the very, very high levels that we're at now, we should plan to have a reduction in the level of resource use, which very well may lead to a reduction in economic activity. So we should make sure that that is done as equitably and well planned out as possible. And that will actually give, more space for other places in the world who have not had time to build up their core provisioning capacity and to actually do so. And so that degrowth and doughnut economics are completely aligned. Often we don't use the term degrowth, but that's mainly just because it's a type of thing that you can end up spending more time sometimes, depending on the setting, debating over the definition of what you're talking about, what needs to degrow, So I prefer to use the language. Okay, the donut gives me the vocabulary to say, what do we want to live in the donut? We want to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. If you're in a high-eco country, then most likely you're going to follow a certain trajectory. low-income emerging economies would be different trajectories, and it just allows me to kind of have a more open vocabulary without getting bogged down into kind of, what do you mean degrow? You want to make everyone poor, you want to throw over, and it's not saying that,
no,
but
that totally
other than
makes
that, it's totally aligned to me. I mean, degrowth and Doughnut Economics have far more in common than some other schools that may be much more conventional, like growth-based economic thinking.
No, it's no, that's just been the whole convention. Like, I took one outside of school class on environmental economics, and even then, that growth was just still very much ingrained there. But the alternatives are so important, and with the big countries, that's kind of like ingrained almost, that model that's been standard for so long. And I'm really interested in what was the process like of, on the part of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, of implementing something like this model into an actual city and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you mentioned Amsterdam earlier. The story there is really, really interesting. So Amsterdam was working together with in a program called the Thriving Cities Initiative. So it was part of a big collaboration of cities called C40 cities, and Amsterdam was a member of them. And they reached out to Kate to say, hey, we have these like kind of world's most ambitious climate-friendly cities, and can we think of a methodology that could go together to that they could actually put into practice and use for monitoring and so on. And Kate and some other colleagues, notably the biomimicry thinker Janine Benyets, who I very much recommend checking out her work as well, had been developing a methodology that could be applied to places, that was essentially looking at, because the global donut is a global picture, right? That it says we will meet the needs of all people within the needs of the living planet. But as soon as you start wanting to apply policy in a place, that global picture starts being, it doesn't capture all of the realities of any, at smaller scales. And so this methodology that was picked up in Amsterdam started asking about, how can our place become a home to thriving people in a thriving place? So how do we meet our local aspirations while respecting the health and well-being of all people and the whole planet? So how do we acknowledge local aspirations and global responsibilities and balance those two? And when you do so, you end up with this framework that we call a data portrait, that basically has these four key parts, where we're thinking about local social thriving for people, local ecological thriving for place, global ecological, health of the whole planet, and global social respecting the well-being of all people, even if they're not necessarily in your place. And so Kate worked together with the city of Amsterdam and came out with what they called the Amsterdam City Donut. And they worked on it for about a year in 2019, and we're aiming to publish it and then follow it up it was presented as a tool for workshops and transformative action. And they ended up publishing it in April 2020, which of course we all know, everything changed and in-person workshops and all of that just went kaput. And the whole plan, just didn't work out for the further parts. But what happened was that just because of that moment, the April 2020 was the height of the very first wave of the COVID pandemic, when there was quite a lot of traction in the media. It got picked up by The Guardian in particular, and framed as if, as Amsterdam was using this new framework to emerge and create a new system, economic system that would be stronger and more resilient in the face of things like pandemics and climate and this and that. So it was a little bit of the moment that actually generated quite a lot of traction and attention, and so much. I mentioned peer-to-peer inspiration before, because I think that it's one of the strongest forces that I have seen. Because as soon as that, some Kate can get up on a stage and she's brilliant, but it makes such a difference when it's a mayor or a deputy mayor who's speaking these, because other mayors and other deputy mayors can say, hey, that Amsterdam is doing it, and Brussels got in touch within months, and saying, inspired by the action that Amsterdam had taken, Brussels and other European cities like Copenhagen and Barcelona and London and Glasgow, and in the U.S. There's Philadelphia and Portland. There's a California Doughnut Economics kind of network. So there are others who are picking up this tool, and so many of them were inspired by the approach and the methodology that was unveiled in Amsterdam. And today I think it's almost like 70 cities that are, picking up these tools and adapting them to their own context. So a key part of that methodology that I mentioned is like that you want to be measuring performance with respect to each of these 4 lenses, but at the same time that you also need to identify targets. Like, what is the goal here? Like, what does thriving mean to people here, or how? And defining those targets it's a conversation, because oftentimes there's conflicting and contested views on what it means to live well. And I think that's fine, because not every place is the same, and we need to take into account locally relevant context. So.
Yeah, no, but even despite those differences, like, it's still possible. Like, all of the cities that you mentioned, they're all so different. But I mean, just since the breakthrough of that, it seems so much more like of a reality that seems feasible. And no, that's super cool. Because for me, it's when I first learned about this stuff, it was like, when can we get past the theories and actually see this be implemented? But it's been implemented, and that's super awesome. I guess
but I will be. Or sorry.
Oh no, continue. Yeah.
No, I'd just say that, I mean, it's still very much early days too, though. So I would emphasize that, like, I would love to see the types of outcomes, like changes in outcomes, where I could say, Amsterdam is now, like, has emissions, less than net zero, or doing something that's like tangibly, is now actually meeting the needs of all its residents along racial and gender and wealth, and like acknowledging the global supply chains and forced labor and slavery. There's a lot to go. And what we've seen so far is the changes that the deputy mayor is talking about this, and that they're institutionalizing processes to monitor, and that so it's still not turning the boat, so to speak, but it's like, maybe you need to start from
it's super cool to see the progress, though, for sure. And I guess, like, and I mean, you kind of started touching on this, but what is that aspect of quantitative analysis? And I'd love to go into some of the research that you have done and the tools that you've made, like the National Donuts Data Explorer. Did I remember that name correctly? Yeah.
You did. You're pretty good. Okay, so I need to just, full disclosure right now, I am very much a data nerd. So this is a dangerous question that you have just asked, that we may never get out of here. No. So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm quite passionate about making visible this worldview, this paradigm that I'm convinced is just, what is needed at this moment in time, is to see the world as the economy embedded in society, embedded in the earth system, and we're fully dependent on both of them, and we can redesign the economy because it's a human construct. And so how do we make that visible and compelling, and so that we can share it with others? And one of those ways is through, the data slogging and collecting data and assigning targets and indicators. But another one that I've dedicated quite a lot of energy to is making things as widely accessible as possible, so that if I'm going to dedicate my time and energy to this research, then I want to make sure that others can pick it up and use it as easily as possible. That goal, that passion, took me on a rabbit hole of trying to learn web development from nothing. But I had the privilege to get a little bit of funds to be able to develop this website, which is hosted at the University of Leeds. It's called goodlife.leeds.ac.uk, where you can explore all of the results country by country. So I've led one study that looks at, essentially tracks national performance, both socially and ecologically, with respect to targets across nearly 150 countries from the early 1990s to 2015, and then with projections to 2050. So anyone who deals with data, and so in total there's almost 20 indicators per country over a 25-year period, plus projections, and you end up getting a lot of data.
Yeah.
If you give somebody a spreadsheet with 30,000 rows of all of this, there's quite a niche crowd that can do anything with that. But just the wonders of modern internet browsing now is that you can design visualizations that allow anyone with an internet connection to query that data and say, wait, I want to look up the United States, I want to look up Senegal, I want to look up Malawi, I want to look up UK or Spain or this or that, and actually see all of the results that we have done and use that as an entry point, as a visualization. So those donut graphics, a lot of people find them quite compelling because they bring together quite a few things that are often separate. Like if your listeners are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, they contain a lot of the same aspects, but they don't have that visual kind of breakdown that allows you to see differences across indicators in the context of a greater whole. And so a lot of people find those national donut visualizations quite compelling for that reason. And we use that as almost an entry point, where if you want to dive deeper into any particular indicators, then you can do so. You can also explore the data yourself, or read the scientific publications or the blogs or this and that. So that's one thing that anytime I publish any scientific literature, which has tended to be my route for publication, which is useful because others can pick it up and cite it and so on, but it's kind of niche too. It's not it's not going to turn into a bestseller like some books and so on and so on. So I think that extra effort of making the results available and that you can then put in the article is like, hey, and go to this website where you can find all of the additional details, then that helps get the word out. And to me, it helps make it all worthwhile, because now that I do that, it's like I'm almost unable to not do it. I'm just like, well, why would I even write or publish anything if I don't make it as widely accessible as I possibly can? So
yeah, no, definitely. This is honestly like a topic that I've talked about before, that like just sometimes there's bubbles in academia versus like actually that in implementation or just accessibility of that, academia that's been, a lot of work has been put into that. So I mean, just really appreciate how you've, made it accessible. And yeah, it's I guess like a part of that is what are some of the challenges or maybe just hopes for the future that you have for, actually implementing Doughnut Economics and just like bridging that gap between the like economics literature and that actual policy implementation side of it.
Yeah, those are. I mean, it comes down to context. I always end up with I wish I had a policy checklist to say, well, you should do this. But what we actually observe, and we've seen the most interest coming from cities. Cities are smaller settlements, not so much at national level, although they're starting to come in. And my theory is that I feel like cities are a scale that like people can relate to more easily. Like, a national government is a bit more abstract, right? Like in a city, you actually know the streets and that balance between almost like the idea of growth, the growth in economic activity at the city scale where you live is more easily understood to have trade-offs, right? Like that maybe having that factory next door or that something that contributes to economic activity, it might come with some very clear, disadvantages in terms of air pollution, or maybe the pay isn't very good, or, people understand that very clearly. Then that gets washed away at the national level, it seems, where we turn into just like, whoa, GDP grew by 2%. Great. And it's like, it's just crazy. Like that.
Yeah.
It's almost like a police officer going to the city and just saying like, hey, the activity on the streets has increased by 5% this year.
What does that mean?
And you're just like, well, what kind of activity? Was it like people helping grandmas across the street, or was it like breaking enters? Like it makes a big difference. And I think that cities understand that more clearly. But at the same time, we've also seen almost always, especially when you're working with governments, it's working within a system, right? It's almost always somebody who's just super inspired and really pushing at a system. And oftentimes those systems don't want to change. And so we find entry points from, like, essentially it's always by invitation, right? Like, because I'm not working in a city government or anything. So that change maker, that person who's inspired by the ideas reaches out to us. And they might be working in the waste department, or they may be working in the circular economy strategy or the sustainability department or trade or this or that. And they say, well, we can have different entry points into applying these concepts. So what can we do? And we just say, well, you're the one who is fighting this battle. Like, what is like in your place? So how can we support you in, making sure that they're aligned with the core concepts and all of that? But how can we support, and what would be most useful is kind of our general approach to policy implementation. So anything that comes out, for example, the Doughnut was embedded into Amsterdam's circular economy strategy. It's right up at the top. I can only imagine how surreal that must be for Kate, for example, when you have a concept that you kind of drew on a piece of paper or whatever, and now it's embedded at the core holistic framing of a city of Amsterdam's circular economy strategy. But anyway, that's how it was essentially framed. And then using that Doughnut as a holistic kind of framework, then you can start diving in. And in their case, they looked at food and clothing and the built environment and started thinking about, okay, how can we redesign these so that we're using much more sustainable practices, much less raw materials. They started setting targets on to be 50% circular, whatever that means, by 2030, and fully circular by 2050. But I actually love that, the cynic in me is like, wow, what does that even mean? Like,
right.
But also I applaud the ambition when you're not sure exactly what something could look like by 2030 or 2050. But what you can say, and they have done, is said, okay, well, for next year, we want to be 10% and have public procurement by the city itself to be, some higher percentage that I don't remember right now. So that pathway of just ambitious vision of where we want to be, like, out there, coupled with like clear signals so that others can say, okay, this is real. We need to get in front of this. And actually, Amsterdam is now one of the leading cities in terms of architectural, like sustainable, circular architectural design. And I think that a part of it is because the city has said, we're not going to be building like in the same old way. So if you want to build here or retrofit or do things in Amsterdam, then you're going to have to be, applying these standards. And that allows the design schools to actually say, okay, well, let's get it going. And the students then say, wow, I get to not just do design projects during my practice and then go work for, a business as usual firm just designing square office blocks and made out of concrete, but I can actually use these skills and keep developing. So that's, I guess, a little bit of short term and long term, and how hopefully it can come together and take us in the right direction.
No, this is definitely an area that I personally want to pursue even. And I mean, I guess on the line of that thought, is there any particular challenge do you think that you in your field specifically would encounter that what advice would you have for that and just for anyone that's interested in this work?
hard to think of even what my field is. If I think of ecological economics, it's actually intentionally, it's such a broad field that encompasses almost like it's almost more defined by the problem, which is like that we have a
Maybe.
unsafe and unjust economic system that
Yeah.
needs transforming. And
Maybe.
so,
Yeah, maybe if I could rephrase the question then, like maybe just about your job or whatnot.
yeah. So my job, again, it's got a few roles, but I'll speak to each of them. I can. So if you are a data analysis nerd like I am, then I would certainly recommend what we discussed before, like trying to make your results and to focus on the visuals and on the figures and on making things as simple and yet as compelling and yeah, as you can, and to make sure I dedicate a lot of energy because I love it into how can we make visible this paradigm, and I don't kind of yeah I would say that's quite important because especially in the academic world you come across a lot of figures that are just not
Yeah,
very good.
you can't really
Well,
yeah.
and so how can we tell a visual story through data that can help people see things that they couldn't otherwise see, I guess is something that really inspires me, and also learning from others too. Like it's not something that just came to me naturally, but it's something that I am dedicating more and more time into. It's almost like design. Like how do we design things so that they're fit for the challenges that we face? And if they're not, then is it even worth doing? Kind of question. But that's for the visual element. There's a lot of economic type of analysis that is tied into this notion of growth and green growth, that we can grow out of our problems, or that we can somehow reconcile eternal economic growth with the already challenging ecological conditions that we face. And I think that it's worth pushing back and learning more against that line of thought, because when you do so, the empirical evidence supporting it is very, very weak. Of course, we do need technological innovation to reduce carbon emissions and to do things more efficiently. But also, there's, especially in high income nations, there's a need to talk about just reducing and just doing well with less. And some research results really show that people can actually be better off. That so much of the resource use of a national economy is not going toward meeting people's needs. It's actually going towards, just elite accumulation and luxury consumption and things that the vast majority of people don't see, and yet we're entrenched in this system. And I think that's worth unpacking too.
Yeah, definitely. Oh gosh. Well, yeah, I just realized, I really want to respect your time. I've learned so much already. And really, really appreciate this conversation. No, I guess like to close off, if you could turn back time, this is a question I've asked every episode, butterfly effects aside, and tell your younger self something that you wish you had known earlier. Like this could be at the beginning of your career or even before that, but like what was something that you would say to them?
Ooh, that's a good one. What would I say to my younger self? I don't know. My younger self was maybe just no, I would say to not wait until my 6th year of economics to discover some of the things that I found. Like I found, like, yeah, I would tell my younger self to actually question more about this idea of, particularly around growth and how it's entrenched in economics education, and to question whether that, what sense does that make on a finite planet? But I didn't think of that. I honestly didn't until like
Yeah.
6 years in. But and then I felt stupid, to be honest, when I did, because but it took somebody who just reading it to be like, oh yeah, shoot, that was dumb. So I would tell my younger self, I would maybe be that person.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for discovering ecological economics by accident. Yeah, no, this is something I'm super excited about. So just again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And for those that, want to keep up with the work that you're doing or access the resources that you've shared, where can they find you?
I was more active on Twitter, or X,
Oh,
formerly
X, oh
Twitter,
boy. Jeez.
which is
That's
just yeah.
yeah.
So I'm active on there. Well, I was, but I'm more transitioning to a new platform called Blue Sky. I'm not sure if you've heard of that as a social media platform. There's also the website that I mentioned, which just has all of the visualizations, which I would definitely recommend, goodlife.leeds.ac.uk. And definitely the platform of Doughnut Economics Action Lab, where we make available all these tools and stories, and we invite anyone to join as a member. More than 10,000 people who are contributing to this. So that's kind of you can find me on there as well.
Thank you so much. That's super cool. Yeah, no, again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks a lot for the super interesting conversation and the questions, and keep in touch.